Good afternoon and welcome to everybody. It's fair to say that this is the first webinar undertaken by the Ductwork Group, and certainly it's the first for Jim Murray and myself. I think it's fair to say that we've finally arrived in the 21st century. It's appropriate that the subject today covers fire and smoke hazards, and more specifically DW 145, the new best practice guide for the fire and smoke damper installation. This guide was published by the HCCA in 2010 and was launched by the Ductwork Group at the Ductwork Group's AGM in May 2010. It is right to say that the response from the building services sector since its launch has been disappointing. However, the installation of fire and smoke dampers form part of a building's life safety strategy, and DW 145 sets out the process of installation and the individual responsibilities of the team as a whole. As Tim suggested, at the end of the presentation you'll be able to ask questions online in what time we have left within the hour. Jim Murray, can you take us through your presentation, please?
Thank you, Kevin. As far as the presentation is concerned, Kevin mentioned technical questions. I would ask that any questions are generally relating to DW 145. It's not possible at this moment to answer any questions on a specific project problem, but if you do have any, by all means make reference to the HVCA website at the end of the seminar, and you will be able to send those in and we will do our best to give you an impartial response to them. DW 145, I think before we actually look at the implications of DW 145, it's important to recognise the part that the HVCA Ductwork Group have played in previous publications and leading up to this latest one, DW 145. I think most of you will be familiar with DW 144, the specification for sheet metal ductwork, along with its sister publication, A Practical Guide to Ductwork Leakage Testing, and also specifications for plastic ductwork. What we've also done within the HVCA is we've introduced a document called Working Together, but again that's an in-house document that's been created by the mechanical services contractors and the ductwork contractors, but it does emphasise the fact that within the HVCA we're attempting to work as a team. Take great pride in working together on a technical basis. Two documents that have been published in recent years have been the Guide to Good Practice for Internal Cleanliness of Ventilation Systems, TR19, and also the specification for kitchen ventilation systems, both of which have become Bibles in their own respect in a similar manner to DW 144. Obviously, both documents are concerned with the limits, limiting the spread of harmful bacteria with regard to the cleanliness, and also with regard to the kitchen vent, the fire. A lot of these documents are used now as reference documents by insurance companies to drive their own activities with regard to settlements, etc. So again, these are important aspects of the industry. We've also collaborated with the HVCA, with the ASFP on a technical basis. The ASFP produced a guide referred to as the Blue Book on Fire Resisting Ductwork. This covers smoke extraction systems, pressurization systems, car park systems, kitchen extract systems, compartmentation of buildings, standard fire tests on ductwork, penetration seals and supports, and it also includes system data sheets of ASFP members who can manufacture fire resisting ductwork, which doesn't have any real connection with DW 144 in terms of the manufacture. With regard to fire dampers and the fire damper installation, the HVCA Ductwork Group and its members have always had a particular problem because we're at the sharp end of the installation. And when a non-compliant installation is identified, it's quite often us that have to go and find the answers, find and resolve all the problems, and we're very conscious of the fact that everyone in the team needed to be aware of their responsibilities. The insurance companies quite rightly are keen to apportion blame, and but there was no standard practice from design through to installation. Everyone had got experience from specific projects, but there was nothing in writing that allowed people to backtrack and see where we're going. Whilst we're at the lower end of the chain as far as the installation as against the design, we were aware of the fact that the ductwork group were in some respects the tail wagging the dog. So it was decided that we couldn't go it alone with regard to fire dampers, and that we would have to again work closely with the ASFP. Having worked with them on the Blue Book, we decided to get in with them and HEVAC and start working towards the Grey Book. Apologies about the reference to any specification being called the Grey Book, but that's the ASFP. They like to work with colours, and there's not a great deal we can do about that. The working group on that ASFP document were damper manufacturers, British Gypsum, penetration seal specialists and test houses. As far as the ASFP guide is concerned, it's acknowledged that it is a very technical document, and like all technical documents, if you're not really a specialist on the subject, it can be heavy reading with regard to the technical content. As far back as 20 years ago, we at the HVCA Ductwork Group were always envisaging being able to produce a practical guide to installation. It's all right having all the technical blurb, but it's important that the lads on the workface are aware of what they need to do, and we explain it in their language. So even before the Grey Book working group started, we reserved the right to produce a complementary but a practical guide, and that has been produced and is known now as DW145, for a guide to good practice for the installation of fire and smoke dampers. The main objectives of DW145, the responsibilities. It's a responsibility that applies to every person in the chain, right from the system designers right down to the installers. Those responsibilities, it is suggested in DW145 that these are set up in the contract so everyone knows what their responsibilities are and the fact that they need to answer to them. The emphasis on teamwork, and this emphasis on teamwork is backed up by the BSRIA guide that was produced by the SEA, Specialist Engineering Alliance, incorporating the likes of CIBSE, ACE, the Specialist Engineering Contractors Group, and it was also supported by household names such as Arup's, Borough Happold, Crown House, MCOR, Lawn Stewart, NG Bailey, WSP, AMEC, SES. I apologise if I've missed anyone else out, but those are the names that appear in the credits of this document. It's a very good document, and we're very grateful to Rudy Klein, who served on that committee, and all during the editorial stages of DW145, Rudy Klein was able to advise us so that the presentation that we had for DW145 mirrored the process that is recommended in this design framework for building services. And it's a very good document, and it's recommended that you do have a look at that if you've not already seen it. One of the main objectives of DW145 is that the damper must be tested along with the penetration seal. In the past, dampers have been tested. They've been tested for fire, penetration and what have you, but it's the penetration seal that's just as important, because it's not always the fact that the ductwork is passing, the fire is passing along the ductwork, but it can also be outside the ductwork and be affected with the penetration seal. It's also important that all installation sketches are project specific. It's no use having a situation where you say to the ductwork contractor, well, just do what you did on the last job. You must have project specific sketches. There must also be a planned sequence of installation. One of the problems that you get with fire damper installation is when you come to install the damper, the wall might not be there, the hole might not be cut. If the hole is cut, it's not a rectangular hole, it looks like a piece of a jigsaw that's been missing, and so on and so on. So it's important that all parties recognise that to lead up to a compliant installation, you've got to have all the sequence of activities. A major factor with regard to achieving a compliant damper installation is that the contract should have a CDM coordinator to facilitate good communications. We do make reference in DW 145 how to access the CDM regulations, and it spells out exactly why this CDM coordinator has got a responsible and an important activity to assist by answering questions, etc., at the design stage, the questions with regard to the fire damper manufacturers. He's the focal point, or they are the focal point for anyone to come back and question or query or resolve any issues. The problem with fire damper installation, if you've got late problems, you've got big problems. And ductwork contractors are well aware of that and are very experienced in solving or attempting to solve late and big problems. The main practical considerations of DW 145: we utilise generic methods. HVAC were very keen that whilst we had illustrations in DW 145, it had to be recognised that only specific dampers and their penetration seals that have been tested should be utilised on contracts. But we, within the ductwork group, felt that it was important that users recognise some of the generic methods. Another key aspect with the advent of dry lining walls, dry lining partitions and the stability, again, British Gypsum have been involved in at different stages of the development, both with the ASFP committee and with the ductwork group. And it's important to recognise that you don't just cut a hole in an existing dry line partition, frame the rectangle and hope that everything's okay. The stability of that partition has got to be taken right back to the soffit and to the slab itself. And we visited the Eastleigh premises of British Gypsum, and they showed us in their training centre the problems with dry lining stability. So again, it's a key aspect. Two problems that the industry's always been faced with are the instruction in a lot of damper manufacturers' product specification of damper tabs that to be built in or tied back to the builder's work. In the case of concrete openings, it also says that they've got to be tied back to exposed reinforcing bars. Now, anyone who's been in ductwork contracting will know that sometimes even having a hole for a fire damper is one thing, but having a hole in a concrete wall with exposed reinforcing bars for us to tie back to is unheard of and totally impractical, and the holes are created at a time when the ductwork contractor is not even on board. Some of the sketches and some of the manufacturers' data that's been put out, because you don't have exposed reinforcing bars, they were expecting the ductwork contractor to fasten in lugs within the inside of the hole and then tie back to the wires. All this came from the fact that in the early days of testing of fire dampers, unfortunately, at one of the test sessions, during the course of the test, the damper fell out of the furnace, and they decided the best way to overcome this would be to fasten the damper back to the exposed reinforcing bars in the face of the furnace, and that is where it originated from. Another aspect that absolutely amazed the ductwork group is the fact that we established with HVAC that out of all fire dampers sold in the UK market, more than 60% of them were sold without expansion frames, and yet expansion is a critical aspect of the installation of the fire damper. Everyone's aware of the HVAC HVAC frame that's been around for years, but the fact that 60% of the dampers were sold without these frames or without any way of introducing expansion is quite frightening. Because of the fact that there are a lot of impractical methods on the market, and that's with no due respect to any damper manufacturer, but we were asked by the ductwork group executive as a result of a meeting between 3 or 4 key ductwork contractors and 3 or 4 major damper manufacturers of HVAC, the technical committee of the ductwork group were asked if we could come up with a couple of methods that would satisfy the majority of damper installations in the UK. And you'll see in DW 145 that we have introduced methods 1 and 2, which are a clamping method and the use of breakaway joints. Very similar, if anyone's familiar with the SMACNA standards, it's very similar to their standards, and they attach a great deal of importance to breakaway joints. The breakaway joints can either be cleated joints adjacent to the fire damper, where the cleats are made of plastic, so that in the event of a fire, they break away and the duct can collapse. They can be a flexible joint, or they can be socket and spigot with aluminium alloy rivets. The penetrations must be as tested, and they must be service free. Every fire damper manufacturer that tests their product tests it with a specific penetration seal, but there've not got to be any other services that pass through that aperture. If you come to fit a fire damper, you can see the electrical contractor or the pipework contractors ran pipes through that aperture, then that is a point of reference that needs to go back to the CDM coordinator to establish what needs to be done. More often than not, it will involve removing those services and running them through a different route. It's easy for some contractors to pick the closest available hole, but in terms of fire protection and the responsibilities for ensuring that there are no future problems, it's important that those things are recognised. Another big aspect is the spatial requirements to fit a fire damper. And this also doesn't involve just the time you fit the fire dampers, it's also for future access, so that during the course of the building in daily use, regular tests can be carried out and you can get back to the dampers, you can do a damper blade drop test and what have you. And it's important that you plan all that into the design. The main achievements of DW145. You will find, as with the design framework for building services, that we have design, installation, inspection and handover checklists. It's as simple as saying that if you go through those design, all the checklists, if you go through and you can satisfy yourself that you've covered every criteria, then you're 99% guaranteed to have a compliant installation. If you can't do that, or you foresee a problem, that's where the CDM coordinator comes in. It's for them to resolve the issue. There's a complete list of technical information to be provided by the system designer to the damper installation contractor. Again, it's not just a question of saying, well, do what you've always done. It's important that the system design on that specific contract is relayed to all the necessary people via the fire damper manufacturer, whose information, certified information, be used, right down to the installation contractor. It has to be emphasised that with regard to DW145, that this is a guide to good practice. It's not a specification, unlike DW144. As a guide to good practice, user feedback is a key to its future success. It's important that if anyone using DW145, they do find any issues that they can't come to terms with or are unable to resolve, even be they a CDM coordinator, then the HVCA ductwork group would be quite happy, and the HVAC and the fire damper manufacturers would be quite happy to try and resolve these issues, and to also make sure that future copies of that guide are updated to accommodate any practical feedback. The biggest single achievement of DW145 is the fact that we've got endorsements, and those endorsements come from various key associations: the Association for Consultancy, AIS, the Association of Interior Specialists, BRE, which is a building research establishment which now incorporates the Loss Prevention Certification Board, Fire Industry Association, FIA, the Fire Protection Association, a key one, the Federation of Plastering and Drywall Contractors, the LABC, which is even more important. Everyone in those organisations have seen DW145, and they're included in a list of endorsements at the front of the guide. And that's an emphasis on the fact that the teamwork is necessary. All these parties have bought into the fact that DW145 is a good practical approach to installing fire dampers. Out of all that, the biggest single achievement, as far as we're concerned, is that CIBSE have also endorsed the document. And again, that confirms that the designers at the front end of the system are appreciative of what needs to be done. The consequences of fire are extremely serious. You must take your responsibility seriously. If you see anything wrong, or if you're put into a position, gone are the days where you can just hope that it'll be covered up and that you can just leave it alone and walk away from it. There is a practice within the industry where the partition contractor comes along, he puts the partition in, the ductwork contractor comes along and fits the fire damper, and they don't even worry or think about, will it be okay for the penetration seal contractor to actually fit the penetration seal. If that contractor finds that he can't fit the penetration seal, he's got to go back to the CDM coordinator. The ductwork contractor's got to go back. It's a very serious consequence of ignoring them, because at the end of the day, if you have in any way contributed towards a non-compliant installation, then you've got a very good chance that a good lawyer will find you out. And I think nowadays we all understand the implications of that. So if you think breakfast at the Savoy is expensive, imagine how much this breakfast cost. If you play with fire, you'll get your fingers burned. In concluding, I'd just like to emphasise that the key points of DW 145, there are 3 key points. The system designer is to establish a compliance arrangement that is specific to the project. The second point, all parties must familiarise themselves with the design illustrations. So it's important that you realise what your responsibilities are, and that when you pass them on to the next party to continue in achieving a compliant installation, you make sure that they can do it. If not, you can be quite happy that somebody will come knocking on your door and they'll ask you to start again or make sure it's put right. The third, and probably the biggest one, is the fact that any issues and queries must be channeled back through the CDM coordinator. It is a legal responsibility through the CDM regulations that every project employs a CDM coordinator, and he can make sure that someone is specifically allocated the responsibility of making sure that compliant installations are achieved. Everything in DW 145, all the publications that I've referred to in this presentation, are all available via the website www.hvca.org.uk. Thank you for your attention, and by all means, if you have any questions you'd like to send in, we'd be only too pleased to answer them.
Jim, this is Kevin again. I think we've got one question that came in by email prior to the webinar today. It's from KJ Tate Engineering in Glasgow. I am very interested about support details for fire dampers installed within flexible sealing void fire barrier. Requirements of support type and size of supports available, certification, etc. As far as I know, there is no manufacturer who did testing in reality, just BRE assessment. Is this correct, that with the introduction of new BSEN 15650 testing will be mandatory and no assessment will be possible to BS 476? And finally, is gripple wire use possible for fire damper installation? Are there any tests for this application? I presume just fire test data for gripple wire is not sufficient enough.
With regard to the first part of the installation, the question, yes, we're aware that fire curtains in fire barrier voids are around, and that there are instances where ductwork will pass through them. One of the problems is that a lot of fire damper manufacturers, they've not produced test data, and it will be up to them and it will be up to the design team to decide how they're going to approach that particular problem. I support the view that some manufacturers haven't got that test data, but that's a reason for the design team to have a look at it and decide how to overcome that problem. With regard to the use of gripple wire for damper installation, I think it's got to be remembered that as far as DW 144 is concerned, the supporting of the ductwork is exactly as you would have on any contract. The ad hoc tests have been undertaken at BRE where a damper system complete with penetration seal and fire dampers and ductwork, where it's subject to a fire in a furnace, and yes, the fire damper collapsed with DW supports at the normal frequency, and the actual test that was done was on a socket and spigot, which is the more traditional way of actually having that kind of breakaway joint, and the aluminium alloy rivets and the screwed rod collapsed before anything else. The ductwork broke away, but the fire damper was still clamped into the partition. The need to introduce breakaway joints with cleats and flange joints and plastic cleats and also flexible connections, they're all valid methods, but the system designer determines the method that suits the type and the configuration of the ductwork. Circular ducts, for example, do lend themselves to socket and spigot connections, and you can use any one that you want, and everything's in DW 145 to confirm that.
Okay, thanks for that. This is Tim Dwyer. Okay, thanks for that. This is Tim Dwyer. I've got another question that's coming over the web. This is from someone in one of our Scottish webinar watchers. They're just asking, are insurance companies aware of DW145, and will they be key to its wider adoption?
I shall be back with you now. Yeah, as far as insurance companies are concerned, the FIA, I think it is, they represent insurance companies, and going back to the time we were in bed with the ASFP producing the fire damper installation guide, the insurance companies did play an important part in recognising that these documents were available, and they're quite happy to see them. They will be referring to them, the insurance companies and their lawyers, should anything occur. So it's in everyone's interest to make sure they're familiar with DW 145 and every aspect of it. Don't just concentrate on your own responsibility. Have a look and see what responsibilities you've got to the rest of the team. But yes, the insurance companies are very keen. They've done it with kitchen extract systems, they've done it with cleanliness and what have you. The insurance companies, if they can see any cause for concern that anything is untoward with regard to an installation, they will be very quick to come down on you.
Well, thanks for that. I've just got another question here from the web. This one's from Surrey, and should fire dampers always be motorised? This questioner understands there's a problem with testing if they're not.
I got a bit of feedback on the line there with regard to the testing of motorised dampers. As far as damper installation is concerned, yes, all dampers before they're handed over to the client, be they drop tests or motorised tests, they must be tested. Not only does that confirm that the product that you've installed is working correctly, but it also allows the building occupier to know that in terms of future tests, be they annual or whatever, they'll be set by the fire damper manufacturers and the building regulations. It does allow you to go back over and make sure that the dampers operate, and it also confirms the amount of space that you've got to go back to. If, for example, if you do a fire damper drop test and you are finding it difficult to get back into where the fire damper is, by the time that building's been kitted out with furniture, etc., etc., it's a key aspect of all fire damper installations. A lot of people ignore the fact that the spatial requirements around and in front the fire damper, if they're covered with pipes and they're covered with building services and you can see an access to a fire damper, an access panel to a fire damper, and it's obstructed, it needs pointing out, because it's no use just hoping that it'll go away. It won't. As far as dampers, not all dampers need to be motorised. There are various forms of damper, and the fire damper manufacturers will be quite happy to speak with the system designers to establish which is the correct fire damper for their particular project. I'm led to believe that concludes the question and answer section, because hopefully everyone's appreciated it that much that they can't see any problems. But by all means, come back to the HVCA if you do. I'll pass you back now to Kevin White to close off the webinar.
Okay. Thanks for that, Jim. I think it's fair to say that the purpose of today was education, and it's not a sales pitch for DW 145, but I suggest that I'll encourage you to buy one as soon as you can. Many thanks for joining us today, and I must say a special thanks for Jim, and let's all have a good day. Bye-bye.